ATF agents corroborate the existence of a racial complaint against Biden's director nominee. Ted Nugent resigns from the NRA board, and an interview with Cam Edwards of Bearing Arms. That and more on this episode of the Weekly Reload Podcast. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of the Weekly Reload Podcast. I am your host, Stephen Gutowski, and I'm also the founder of thereload.com. This week we have special guest Cam Edwards of Bearing Arms here to discuss the nomination of David Chipman to the ATF. But before we get to that interview, I'll just give you a little bit of an update on the news of the week. And before we do that, let me just say that members of the Reload get this a day early. So if you would like to have the podcast delivered to you exclusively before everyone else, you should go ahead and sign up. We're over right on thereload.com. $10 a month, $100 a year. You get 2 months off if you buy a year. Pretty good deal, I think, but I may be biased. So first, let's talk about David Chipman. President Biden's nominee to run the ATF came under increased scrutiny this week after I published an exclusive piece at The Reload detailing agents, former agents, current agent, and their complaints about his demeanor as well as his long history of working for gun control groups and how that could affect the performance of the agency if he were to be confirmed. And of course, they also corroborated the existence of allegations that Chipman made racist remarks while he was in the Detroit office of the ATF when he worked for the ATF. There was a FOIA lawsuit, it's still ongoing, that got filed in June. The group behind that, AAF, claimed that an ATF agent was concerned after hearing Chipman say that black agents, too many black agents, had passed an assessment in order to earn a promotion, and that he said that they must have cheated in order to do so. And that agent filed a complaint against Chipman. Now, Chipman has confirmed the existence of 2 complaints filed against him during his time at the ATF. He said that they had been resolved without reprimand, but he did not disclose the details of those complaints. That is what's alleged in the lawsuit. Chipman told Senator Ted Cruz of Texas, the Republican, that that these complaints did in fact exist, but that they'd been resolved. Now, after I read news of the lawsuit and the claims made against Chipman, I thought if this was in fact true and not fabricated, that there should be some other ATF agents who heard this same story. And so I went and did what reporters do, and I asked around and found 2 sources, a current agent and a former agent, who corroborated that they had in fact heard this story before news of it came out in the form of this lawsuit. So that has gotten most of the attention at this point from the political world on Capitol Hill, with Mitch McConnell, the minority leader, calling for President Biden to withdraw Chipman over these allegations, and all of the members, all 11 Republicans on the Senate Judiciary Committee, calling for a new hearing to investigate the allegations further to see what is in fact inside of these complaints and what Chipman has to say about them. I did, of course, reach out to the White House for comment from David Chipman, but did not receive any in return, and nor did I receive comment from the DOJ, and the ATF itself said that they could not comment on nominees for director. And so that's where that story stands. We're still waiting to see if these complaints will be released, and whether or not David Chipman or the White House will put out any sort of statement on it. In the meantime, I have been smeared, I guess would be a proper term for it, by the president of Brady United, which is a gun control group that is supporting David Chipman's nomination, essentially claiming without evidence that I have made up these sources and that I have secret motivations from being part of the gun lobby. Now, of course, this is all baseless. The sources are certainly real. This is a common tactic when someone doesn't like a story that features sources whose identities have been withheld. In this case, the identities have been withheld of 2 of the 3 sources because they're actually fearful of reprisal from David Chipman. One said he has a reputation for being a bully and that he could see Chipman reassigning agents he doesn't like to far-flung posts. He would have the ability to do that as director, and so I felt their concerns were legitimate and allowed them to remain anonymous so that they could share their concerns without fear of backlash, at their workplace. So, of course, I'm also not part of the gun lobby. The Reload is a fully independent and reader-funded publication, hence the pitch for the membership earlier, which, by the way, if you aren't a member yet, you should join, not just to support my reporting, but also to get exclusive access to not only this podcast early, but a bunch of posts that others, non-members, cannot read. So especially a lot of my analysis is usually reserved for members, where I give my take on the situation and what's going on. For instance, I wrote recently a piece on Chipman's nomination. The longer he waits in limbo without support from all 50 Democrats, the more it becomes likely that he will not be confirmed, regardless of my latest story or not. So you can check that out if you are a member already on the Reload, but it's also another good reason to become a member. So you should join today if you, in fact, have the $10 to spend on the only place that's going to do this kind of reporting. No one else apparently has the sourcing to find ATF agents to corroborate whether or not these allegations exist. I'm the one who did it. So that counts for something, I think, when you're looking for journalism to support or to pay for. Anyway, I also have a story, speaking of my status as a member of the gun lobby, supposedly, according to Chris Brown of Brady. I also broke news this week that Ted Nugent has resigned from the NRA board. NRA General Counsel John Frazier sent an email to board members, other board members, informing them that Ted Nugent, the rock star who's said many controversial and awful things over the years, frankly, but who has also been one of the top boosters of the organization for the last several decades. He's been on the board. He's no longer on the board now. The NRA said that this was over scheduling conflicts, but Nugent had been outspoken in 2019. I'd interviewed him at the NRA annual meeting that ended with Oliver North being removed from the presidency of the NRA and a big blow up during the members meeting. But Nugent himself had said that he wants total transparency from the organization, and that was the main reason that he was going to be a board member, and that he didn't believe that they should spend outrageous sums of money on personal expenses. But now apparently he is resigning from the board, but he has not put out a statement yet. All we have is what the NRA told its board members to this point. So you can check out that piece over at thereload.com as well. But now we're going to move on real quick here to our guest, Cam Edwards, to discuss the fallout of my recent story on David Chipman and how this could all affect whether or not he becomes the next director of the ATF. All right, welcome, Cam Edwards of Bearing Arms. Appreciate you coming on the show. Why don't you take a second here to introduce yourself to all the listeners who might not know who you are?
Absolutely. And thank you for the invite. It's nice having the shoe on the other foot for a change. So, yes, I'm the editor at BearingArms.com, the host of the Bearing Arms Cam and Company podcast. Before that, it was Cam and Company from NRA News and NRA TV. And obviously, Stephen, you have been, I don't know how many hundreds of times you and I have talked before, but it's awesome what you're doing with the Reload. I'm really excited to be a guest here on the podcast. And congratulations on making enemies of all the right people with your reporting.
Well, that's not the goal, but I appreciate you saying that. We have obviously known each other for a long time here, and I've long respected you as somebody who is very honest in your writing and in your when you're hosting your podcasts, and I've been a guest a number of times on your show, so it's great to be able to have you come on this show here, because I think you provide a perspective that's very rare out there, which is sort of a realistic approach to gun politics, somebody who's really informed on what's going on in D.C. And follows it closely, and somebody who knows guns as well, which is really not a very common combination out there, frankly. And that's why I wanted to have you on to, discuss some of the big news that broke this week that I was able to break over at the Reload, specifically dealing with David Chipman, President Biden's ATF nominee, who, there was a lawsuit filed, FOIA lawsuit filed last month, which sought the release of his complaints filed against him with internal complaints while he was working at the ATF, which Chipman himself has admitted exist, to Senator Ted Cruz of Texas, the Republican, and the group that filed those complaints said in an interview with the Daily Caller that one of them was related to alleged racist comments that Chipman had made about black agents who were up for promotion and how they must have cheated on an assessment in order to get to that list for promotion. So I looked into this complaint. This came out. There was not much reporting done on this outside of the initial piece at the Caller, which detailed the claims. And I thought, well, if this really happened, then other people should have heard about it inside the ATF. And so I went and asked a number of ATF contacts if they had heard about it, and they have. So that corroborates that this, allegation, at the very least, is something that people had heard inside of the ATF before this lawsuit came out, which obviously lends some degree of credibility to the initial claim there. And so I've asked the White House and the Department of Justice for comment, to get me comment from David Chipman, and for the release of these complaints that exist, and have gotten no response from them. I have gotten some criticism from the gun control groups, as you alluded to earlier here, that doesn't really engage substantively with the piece. It kind of just does there's a sort of classic move when there's a piece like this comes out that goes against somebody you're supporting, which is just to say that the reporters have ulterior motives, secret motives, and that their sources are all made up, which is essentially what the president of Brady United has claimed here. But I can assure
you're just a part of the extreme gun lobby, and which I think their reaction, I think, shows how worried they are about Chipman's confirmation, because, as you note, Chipman himself acknowledged during his confirmation hearing with the Senate Judiciary Committee that EEOC complaints had been filed. Now, he didn't get into the specifics of what those complaints alleged, but he acknowledged their existence. So that's a legitimate line of inquiry, and not just for reporters, obviously, but for those senators who are going to be voting to confirm or reject David Chipman as the permanent director of the ATF. This is something that I think is a real issue. And it's an issue, frankly, that Chipman could have addressed from the get-go had he been more transparent, had he been willing to talk about what those complaints were. But instead, he simply acknowledged that those complaints existed. He said that they did not result in any disciplinary action. But again, we don't know why that's the case. Were these complaints determined to be completely unfounded, or was this an example of the ATF going light on agents? Because remember, Stephen, the gun control advocates like Chris Brown, the head of the Brady campaign, they claim that the agency is in desperate need of reform, right? That it's a broken agency, that the gun lobby's had its way with the agency for decades. So you could make the argument that, well, maybe Chipman got off light because of a culture of either corruption or a culture of looking the other way within the ATF. We don't know, because David Chipman hasn't said anything about these complaints. And it's ultimately up to David Chipman to satisfy those questions that senators have. The fact that the gun control lobby is, going after reporters for reporting on a legitimate story, it kind of makes you wonder if there's not some fire beyond the smoke. But again, I think it really is a sign that they are increasingly of the belief that Chipman's nomination is in danger.
Yeah, and my interest here, just to be upfront with everybody, is in transparency. Like, these complaints exist. There are now allegations that they were over racist remarks. Mm-hmm. He's up for the director's position of a major agency inside the federal government. It seems fair to ask for those complaints to be made public and for us, the public, to be able to determine the details of those complaints. Maybe Chipman has a good defense for why these complaints were made or how they're not legitimate. Maybe he doesn't. We don't know. That's the problem. And we've seen now the entire Republican caucus on the Judiciary Committee, all 11 members of the Judiciary Committee who are Republicans, signed onto a letter asking for a new hearing on Chipman because of my story. And they want to see the exact same questions answered here. And I think that's fair. I don't see any good reason why these complaints should remain sealed. He's not a normal citizen. He's up for an important position inside the federal government where he's going to be overseeing a lot of black agents, frankly.
Absolutely. And look, even if there are, privacy laws that would preclude the EEOC itself from issuing their findings, David Chipman has a copy. I'm sure David Chipman has a copy of those EEOC findings squirreled away in a desk drawer somewhere. And there's nothing preventing him from releasing any documents that he received, right, in connection with that EEOC investigation.
Or at least giving his side of the story. I'd love to hear his side of the story. Yeah. I reached out for it and didn't get a reply. So, and the gun control advocates who've complained about the story, they haven't given his explanation either. We just don't have all the information yet, and that's my job as a reporter, is to go and try and find it. I was able to corroborate that these allegations exist and that people inside the ATF had heard of them before this lawsuit was filed. So, that's what you're supposed to do in journalism. You're supposed to ask around and look for these sorts of answers. And now I found some. I'd like more information. It's not the end of the story, in my opinion.
Right.
There's more. We should find more. If David Chipman can exonerate himself from these allegations, then he should. I mean, I'd like to hear that, and I would print it. If he sent me his side of the story, I would absolutely include it in my piece or in a follow-up piece. I have no problem doing that. I just think that it's a natural part of journalism to go out and see if you can corroborate allegations made against someone. I didn't make these allegations. I simply reported on them and found out whether or not people could corroborate them, and they could. So that's where we're
absolutely at. But look, this isn't the Brady campaign for better journalism that we're talking about here, right? This is the I guess they dropped the Brady campaign to prevent gun violence. Now they're just Brady, but. Chris Brown isn't interested in the quality of journalism coming out of Second Amendment outlets like the Reload. She and gun control activists are interested in installing one of their own as permanent director of the ATF. That's the ultimate goal here. And the factual reporting that gets in the way of that is what leads these activists to lash out. They can't lash out at David Chipman, so they're going to lash out at the reporters like yourself who are actually bothering to cover this story. And quite frankly, I think gun owners could be even more righteously ticked off at the fact that most media outlets have ignored what you've reported. I haven't seen this in the New York Times or the Washington Post or any other major media outlet. As you say, these are now, you've got agents who, correct me if I'm wrong, but you had at least one agent on the record who said that he had heard these rumors.
Well, there were two agents, current agent who and a former agent who said they'd heard these. And then there was a third agent on the record who, both of those agents were wanted to be anonymous because they were afraid of reprisals, which is something we can also talk about in a bit.
Also,
here, but,
yeah.
And then you had Vasquez, who is another former agent who worked directly with Chipman, who had not heard of the specific allegations, though he said that it was, that doesn't necessarily mean anything because allegations are not necessarily something, these sorts of complaints are not necessarily something that is spread widely around. But he did know that Chipman was sent to Detroit against his will, and then he had also had a number of complaints about him outside of this particular accusation, because the story goes well beyond just this particular accusation, and goes into a number of other issues that these agents had with Chipman and the concerns they have about him, going forward. But yeah, so there's. I believe now there's the initial agent who told the group that filed the FOIA lawsuit, who made the actual complaint. Then there was a second one who backed up the existence of the complaint with the Daily Caller's initial piece. And then now you have two more in my piece who heard about these allegations as well. And the specifics that they told me matched up with what was reported in the Daily Caller, so there wasn't really any difference between the stories. So, he's alleged to have said that to have been surprised by the number of black agents that made it through an assessment for promotion, and said that they must have cheated in order to have done that. So, and obviously, if that's something that David Chipman believes, if he did say that and believes that, that's a problem when you're going to be the director of an agency that has a lot of black agents, and that has had a history of being pseudo-racial discrimination as well. So, it's something that I think is fair for the public to have the full facts on. It's just, to me, maybe Chipman has a good explanation. Maybe he has a good defense. I'd like to hear it.
I think we all would. But as you say, this is only one part of the story that you reported on. And so in a way, it's kind of interesting. I mean, obviously, this is, let's say the most, no pun intended, when we're talking about the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives. This is the most explosive allegation. Right. But the fact that you did have these agents say that they did not want to speak publicly because they are afraid of retaliation, I think is also important here. I mean, again, we are talking about somebody who spent 25 years within the ATF, but has spent much of the past decade in the employ of Mayors Against Illegal Guns and now Giffords as a gun control lobbyist. This guy is an active, committed, paid-for part of the gun control lobby. And so to install him at the ATF, I think one of the agents that you talked to said, look, most of us are non-political. Most of us are actually, pretty pro-gun, but we don't get into the politics of this. Well, Chipman's nomination itself, I think, is an attempt to politicize the agency. But if he's confirmed, it seems to me like there are a lot of agents who do have that concern about what that's going to mean for the agency's reputation going forward, what that's going to mean for these agents' ability to work with law enforcement, to work with the firearms industry, because David Chipman is coming into this with a very adversarial position towards the industry that he would oversee.
Right. Yeah, and that was the other part of the story, really the longer part of the story. These agents had very significant concerns about what the confirmation of David Chipman would mean for the ATF as a functioning regulatory agency, because as you described there, he is a committed activist. Now, he said in his hearing that he would put aside his activism and just, apply the law as it is. Although one of the agents described some of the problems with that because, and this I just read about this in a members piece on Friday, but the ATF director there's quite a lot of discretion in current federal law, especially when you look at things like sporting purpose exemptions. Effectively, the National Firearms Act makes every 20 gauge and 12 gauge shotgun a destructive device by definition, because anything that has a barrel diameter of more than half an inch is considered a destructive device under the National Firearms Act and must be registered, and you have to pay a tax stamp for each one that you own. And the only reason that we don't have every Remington 870 and Mossberg 500 under the National Firearms Act is because there's a sporting purpose exemption for shotguns. And that is one of the big concerns that this agent expressed in this members-only piece that I wrote, where he describes there really is a broad level of power that is not generally exercised or not pushed to its limits in the way that it could be by an activist like David Chipman without requiring any new laws to be passed. This is all unilaterally could be done at the request of the ATF director to the Attorney General. And so there's also the Gun Control Act also has sporting purposes exemptions for ammunition, armor-piercing ammunition, which, we saw a fight over that in the Obama administration when the ATF tried to ban so-called green tip 5.56. That's popular for use in AR-15s because they wanted to remove the sporting exemption from it, and that would have made it effectively illegal to make your own.
Well, look at what they're doing right now with the proposed rules that are up for public comment. Redefining, basically trying to redefine AR-style pistols with stabilizing braces as short-barreled rifles, trying to redefine what an unfinished firearm might be to include basically anything that could be turned into a firearm. And I'll tell you one that is kind of flying under the radar. I think you and I have talked about this in the past, but one of the phrases in the Gun Control Act of '68 is that phrase "readily convertible," right? And so, if something is considered readily convertible to either a firearm or, let's say, a semi-automatic would be readily convertible to a fully automatic firearm, then those items could be regulated under the provisions of the National Firearms Act. You have to register them to the government. You have to pay that $200 tax stamp. And David Chipman himself has talked about in the past wanting to regulate AR-15s like we regulate machine guns. We're now even seeing gun control groups like Brady use this argument in litigation. I don't know if you saw this out of Los Angeles or out of California, but one of the lawsuits that Brady's filed, actually there are two now in California, one over the Poway synagogue shooting, one over the shooting at the Gilroy Garlic Festival, I believe. And Brady is actually making the claim that the manufacturers of the rifles that were used by these killers violated federal law because they manufactured a product that could be, quote, readily converted into a machine gun. Now, neither of these semi-automatic rifles were converted, but they're still arguing in this civil suit that these companies did something wrong simply by making AR-15s because they're making the argument that AR-15s are inherently readily converted into machine guns. And this is something, again, this is an argument that David Chipman could make if he's permanent director of the ATF, that, look, we don't need to go through Congress to ban AR-15s. We can just decide that, no, these are actually light machine guns. You could convert them into a fully automatic machine gun with a little bit of work. You'd be breaking the law to do it. But it's theoretically possible, and so therefore we need to treat these guns as if they're already machine guns. That's actually, those are as you say, that's the type of broad discretionary power that the ATF director has, at least a permanent director has. And we haven't seen an ATF director with this type of activist background and activist agenda like David Chipman has had. So we really haven't had to worry about that, I think, as much in the past. Mm-hmm. But if Chipman is confirmed, we absolutely have to worry about things like that going forward.
Yeah, and it's not to say that he'd be successful if he tried to do any of these things. They're obviously fairly radical moves, but the point is that they're available to an ATF director if they wanted to try and push the boundaries of current law. You would not have to pass a bunch of laws to try and implement these things. It's not outside of the realm of possibilities to push the sporting purpose exemption or the readily convertible definition to its limits, and that could have very broad impacts. And that is what one of the major concerns was about having an activist as director, because like you said, there really hasn't been anyone like David Chipman to become director. It's kind of like if you appointed Wayne LaPierre to be ATF director. If Trump had tried to do that, it would have been somewhat similar to what we're seeing here, and would have probably had a very negative reaction on the other side of the aisle, I would imagine. But
yeah, and I think a much different media coverage, by the way, had Trump nominated Wayne LaPierre as opposed to the media coverage we've seen about Chipman getting nominated, or even if it wasn't Wayne LaPierre, somebody with as high a profile as him,
or somebody.
But let's say it was exactly, or a Chris Cox or a Mark Oliva, but somebody within the Second Amendment community or the Second Amendment industry, or the firearms industry. Yes, that would have been seen as completely unacceptable, a gift to the gun lobby, right? I mean, you can write the headlines yourself. You know what the media coverage would have been, but it's a very different thing. When the Washington Post is talking about the professionalism that David Chipman would bring to the job and the years of service and experience, they want to focus on his 25 years at the ATF, at least portions of his 25 years at the ATF, maybe not everything, but they want to focus on some aspects of his job as an ATF employee, while really just downplaying or ignoring outright the activism that he brings to the table. And again, that's a legitimate dispute. That's a legitimate complaint that people can have. But they want to, this is part and parcel of what they're trying to do here. Every complaint is illegitimate, right? It's either a gun lobby smear or it doesn't matter. It's all outweighed by his, decades of experience within the ATF. Basically, as far as the gun control groups are concerned, you're not allowed to say anything bad about David Chipman. Anything that you say about David Chipman that isn't, praising him to high heavens, is automatically discarded for one reason or another.
And look, there are people spreading things that aren't true about David Chipman, but I'm certainly not one of them. And I've reported on him accurately to this point. It's interesting in the thread that was that Chris Brown put up, the Brady president. She was complaining about these other myths or lies that are out there, at least claims that Chipman has denied. That I don't, that got put into her thread about this story, which didn't include any of that stuff because I don't print stuff that isn't verifiable, and so, it's dishonest. I think the way that thread was put together. But the other problem that a lot of these agents had with the idea of Chipman as an activist, or really any activist, I mean, that's what they all said to me, is that the problem with Chipman is that he's an activist, not necessarily that he's a gun control activist, but that he's an activist at all. They don't really want a gun rights activist to be director either. But in this case, the problem with having somebody who's this adversarial towards the industry as your director is that the ATF makes a lot of cases off of tips from the industry, or at least from like your average FFL, your average gun dealer. And so having somebody in charge who treats FFLs as though they're the enemy, essentially, or that they're, all potential gun traffickers, is something that could have a detrimental effect on the relationship between ATF field agents and gun dealers who give them tips on potential gun running schemes. I mean, that's how a lot of these cases get made. They get tips from FFLs themselves explaining, what the concern is, and then the ATF follows up on that. And all of the agents involved said that that's how they've made a lot of cases over the years. So if you damage that relationship, which is already perilous, I mean, obviously you had the current official, the current ATF agent who still works there. They've been there for a long time, 20 plus years, but they're still there. And, they had described, look, the ATF has a bad reputation among gun dealers and gun owners already, in part because of some gun rights organizations who this agent thinks unfairly demonizes them to a certain degree. But, you don't need to add on top of that somebody who is actively a gun control activist, like literal one, who's paid literally by a number of gun control groups over the years, because that's going to make them much less likely to try and work with you on, the next gun running case that they might, have a tip on.
Absolutely. And, look, we can talk about the ATF's, reputation and whether it is well-deserved or not. I think there's certainly cause for concern. You look at, everything from Operation Fast and Furious to the storefront sting operations that were a part of the Obama administration that ended up being shut down. And, there have been, obviously, and then going back even further, to the 1990s. There are, I think, legitimate complaints and beefs that gun owners have had about the agency. But I will say this, look, the quickest way to repeal or to get rid of the ATF completely is to put David Chipman in charge, because the next time that Republicans have control of Congress, there would be a huge push to defund the ATF, to just get rid of it completely. If you've got an activist in charge. You've already seen, Republicans like Marjorie Taylor Greene come out there and say that ATF should be defunded. Well, that position would become a heck of a lot more mainstream if you actually have an activist in charge of that agency. And I think that would, the Republicans would respond one of two ways. Once they have the power to replace Chipman, either they would try to shut down that agency completely, or they would put their own activist in charge. Right, which again, if you're looking for that agency to be professional and above board, you don't want that. You want to see that professional in place. But again, gun control activists are not really thinking long term here. I think they view this just as a golden opportunity, perhaps the best opportunity that they've ever had to place one of their own at one of the highest levels of government, and clearly they're willing to fight on this. I'm really kind of surprised that the White House is still saying that David Chipman's their guy. Clearly there are major concerns among at least a few red state Democrats like John Tester and Angus King of Maine and Joe Manchin of West Virginia, although I don't know how concerned Joe Manchin might actually be, given some of Politico's report, I think it was, about the meeting that he brokered between Jim Justice and David Chipman. But there are legit concerns. And so I don't know what it's going to take for the White House to cut Chipman loose. But, you can't keep holding this out in limbo. And frankly, I don't know what comes out. Like let's say you're John Tester and you're still kind of on the fence about what you want to do. What comes out going forward that makes you feel better about David Chipman? I don't see how anything comes out in the future that makes me more comfortable to vote for the guy, given the concerns that are already out there. So, I don't know what the end game is here, but I think Chipman is going to remain in a lot of jeopardy. His nomination is going to remain in a lot of jeopardy, even if he tries to address these allegations that we've been talking about here.
Yeah, I think you're probably right about that. I mean, it's not these allegations are just getting attention now, really, after my piece went up. And Chipman's nomination was already in limbo well before then. I think his confirmation hearing didn't really sell a lot of these guys on him. He spent most of the time apologizing and then doubling down on some of his more extreme gun control positions. So I don't know if that helped his case much with people like Tester and King, but it'll be interesting to see exactly what happens with this. I think when Trump put up his nominee, and Republicans weren't happy with him, eventually there wasn't ever really like a big. It's not like the Republican senators came out and had a press conference and were like, "We're not voting for Trump's nominee." It was much more, it was much less climactic than that, and it'd probably be the same way here if Chipman does end up going down. They probably just won't ever put him up for a vote, and then eventually he'll get withdrawn after everyone's stopped paying attention to the issue. That's what I would more expect. But
yeah, I don't know. To me, so when Chuck Canterbury was nominated, that to me didn't get nearly as much attention. Like, we're seeing Politico write these stories about Chipman's nomination in trouble. CNN had a piece, Chipman's nomination. So they're writing that the votes aren't there. They're not writing why the votes aren't there, right? That's the big difference. So I think if the nomination were to get pulled, as opposed to, as you say, just kind of quietly tucked on the shelf, and then maybe 2 or 3 months goes by and a reporter at CNN says, "Hey, whatever happened to that David Chipman guy?" You're right. That could very well happen. But I think that there is enough interest here, on the part of even the Washington-based news media, even if they don't want to cover this issue how I would cover it or how you would cover it. They don't necessarily want to, highlight all of the problems that Republicans have with David Chipman. They do recognize the legitimate story of, okay, you got a Democratic president, you got a Democrat-controlled Senate. They can't get the nominee through. Like, if that happens, and again, I'm not suggesting that we've won this fight by any stretch of the imagination, because we have not won anything yet. But if that turns out to be the case, I think the media is going to be interested in at least reporting on the failure of the Biden administration to get it done. Now, the framing, I suspect, will probably be, look at how powerful the gun lobby still is. Right. The gun lobby still wields this disproportionate influence over senators. I mean, we know, it won't be that David Chipman was a bad candidate who brought too much baggage to the table. Right. They'll have their own little spin here. But I don't know if they can actually just ignore Chipman not having the votes if, in fact, it comes down to that, and Democrats ended up defeating Chipman's nomination.
I mean, yeah, you could be right. Although I don't remember them making a big deal about Trump's ATF nominee not ever getting a vote.
No, but there was so much more that they could,
Trump administration,
be angry about with Trump. There's
a lot more news going on those days. Yes, true.
Right.
But I actually want to go back real quick to something you touched on earlier, which is ATF's culture, I guess, or at the very least how ATF agents perceive themselves. Obviously, there's a lot of things that have happened with the ATF and things that the ATF has done over the years that have received very legitimate criticism from gun rights advocates, and you still see it today with the way that they have messed with determinations on things like pistol braces or the definition of firearm and ghost guns and so forth. The way the agency has sort of flipped back and forth on the legality of certain items like bump stocks and pistol braces. And then obviously things like Waco and Ruby Ridge, which involved the loss of human life and were very controversial in the tactics that got employed in those situations, regardless of the, everything involved in the overall Waco standoff, which was obviously, a very, very controversial thing for many different reasons. Whether or not you think that the Branch Davidians were, or David Koresh was a good guy or whatever. But I think that there's an important dichotomy to point out within the ATF, and that you're seeing that in play with these agents versus David Chipman, which is that field agents in the ATF, and this is common, I think, in a lot of law enforcement, they're actually relatively pro-gun, I would say, for most of them, in my experience at the very least. And certainly they perceive themselves that way. They're more gun enthusiasts. They like guns a lot, and they view oftentimes their job as just prosecuting violent criminals, right? Trying to keep guns away from violent criminals, which is a goal that the vast majority of gun owners also support, of course. And then there's a difference between those people and the more administrative side, the firearms technology side, the people who make the determinations about whether a pistol brace is a makes your gun into a firearm or a felony unregistered short barrel rifle, right? And Chipman, the interesting thing that I was told by all three of these sources in the story is that Chipman is kind of a chameleon to these guys, from what they've told me at the very least. The two of them worked directly with him and said he wasn't, he was a good guy to them. He wasn't this anti-gun zealot when he was working at the ATF, that he supported the industry and worked well with them when he was actually an agent. But he didn't make that turn to being a gun control advocate until after he left and went to work for some of these gun control groups. And so that they're all surprised by that turn from, what they viewed as someone like them to somebody who's more hyper-partisan and more of a gun control activist now. And I think that could also have a detrimental effect on the agency's view of him internally, how a lot of these agents view him if he's made director. That seemed to be the implication for these guys, is like they don't really trust him. One of them called him a Manchurian candidate because he's like, people have, when you work at the ATF for a long time, it's not that big of a agency, frankly. It's smaller than the U.S. Capitol Police Force. So a lot of these guys know each other and have known each other for a long time. And one of the guys who worked with him said, he's asked around with all of his other ATF buddies, and like nobody could really get a good grasp on Chipman. And they have this issue where like either people are hated, people are liked, or there's something in between, but nobody really can nail down what Chipman is like personally. And so I guess that really stuck with these guys in these sort of tight-knit law enforcement communities. I think a lot of them are kind of like that. And so Chipman sort of seems to be on the outs of the ATF community. And so that's not a great sign for a director, especially if one of the main points of putting him in there is that he worked for the ATF for a long time.
Right.
And that, I think that's an interesting thing that's kind of been glossed over because of all the attention on the racism allegations, which obviously are important, but there's a lot more going on with what these agents have said in the piece than just that part of it. And I wonder what your thoughts are in terms of like when you've dealt with ATF agents, how do you see that same dichotomy between like your field agent and your administrator? Because like another thing that they told me is that Chipman never wrote a case, which was like a big deal to some of these guys, that they had never heard of him writing a case, meaning like he never actually went through the whole investigatory process himself on a particular, charge against somebody. And that was sort of, I guess, a big status thing for these guys inside of the ATF community.
Yeah, and you'd think, again, 25 years, you'd have at least one case that you could point to. It's interesting. I mean, what you're describing is almost the dichotomy that you see in, other police forces where the rank and file cops are at least more publicly outspoken in support of the Second Amendment than the politically appointed police chiefs, right? And the top brass. And so I don't know if that's sort of the the same issue at work. But I think that the slipperiness that they describe of David Chipman, like, we worked with this guy for years and years, but we really don't know who he is or what he stands for, because, he left the ATF, and then all of a sudden it surprised us to see him, pop up working for these gun control groups. Did he keep his opinions to himself when he was at the ATF before, or did his opinions change at some point? Like, this would have been something that I really would have liked to have seen Republicans on the Senate Judiciary Committee be able to explore with Chipman. But unfortunately, because of the way that the Democrats set up that confirmation hearing, Chipman was sandwiched in between three other nominees for various federal appointments, and senators only had a couple of minutes apiece, to spend on these four candidates. So if they had a legitimate question for this, a person who's up for a U.S. district judge appointment, well, that takes time away from questions they might have had for David Chipman. And again, that was clearly by design. Democrats wanted to try to make this confirmation hearing as easy as possible for Chipman, but it left a lot of unanswered questions on the table. Like, David, when you say you're not going to bring your advocacy with you to the ATF if you're appointed the permanent director. Well, when did you actually embrace some of these positions? When did you decide that AR-15s should be banned, that civilians shouldn't be able to own them, that they should be registered under the federal government, like machine guns are? When did you decide that every transfer of a firearm in this country should go through a background check or criminal penalty should apply? Like, have you always believed this to be the case? It never came up in conversations with your colleagues, or is this something that you had a change of heart maybe after you got the job offer from Michael Bloomberg when you retired from the ATF? I mean, I don't know the answers to these questions, but they're legitimate questions. And so, now that these Republicans are basically asking for a do-over, asking for a second confirmation hearing, I don't think Dick Durbin's going to oblige them with a second hearing. But, I know that there are a lot of questions that weren't able to be asked the first time around that do, I think, have a legitimate bearing on the decision that these senators are going to have to make. And I think that it is certainly, I think, a valid concern for these senators to have about David Chipman's relationship with ATF employees if he's confirmed, beyond his anti-gun advocacy, beyond what I worry he would do as ATF director. Again, the whole pitch from the Biden administration is this guy's a reformer, right? He's going to come in and he's going to make this agency better. Well, if agents don't trust him, how is he going to do that? And again, that's a legitimate line of inquiry that neither David Chipman nor the Biden administration really, really want to answer.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see how this all unfolds from here on out, I think. But I really appreciate you coming on. You gave us a lot of your time and a lot of your insight, which I think is fantastic. Can you tell us a little bit more about Bearing Arms? It's one of the publications that I personally read a lot and link a lot to. It's one of the best ones out there, in my opinion. There's not, like I said earlier, there's not a lot of publications that can combine knowledge of guns and knowledge of politics quite as well as you can over there at Bearing Arms.
Well, I appreciate that. Like you, I'm not the guy to go to for tips and tactics. I wish that I were, but my specialty really is sort of the political side of this, the legal side of our Second Amendment fights, and that's generally what we tend to focus on at Bearing Arms. So you can get the latest Second Amendment news and information, each and every day of the week. Also, Monday through Thursday, we do the Bearing Arms Cam and Company podcast, which is 20, 30 minutes. It's basically a fairly quick look at one of the top stories of the day. I wish that I had time to do a 3-hour show every day like I used to, but I don't, because I've got the writing to do now. But I do, and I really appreciate you saying that, because like I said, I'm an admirer of your work as well, have been for a long time. So that means a lot that you appreciate what we're doing at Bearing Arms. I never really consider myself a writer by trade. I mean, I started out in television actually as my very first job in television was the guy who pushed the button that played the commercials. And I worked my way up to running a camera, and then, went into radio and was a radio reporter for a long time. So the writing gig is actually pretty new to me. Bearing Arms is my first full-time writing job. So the fact that you haven't mocked my writing skill and style, I greatly appreciate that, Stephen. I thank you very much
absolutely.
for that.
And Bearing Arms also has a VIP membership as well, just like the Reload. So, if people want to head over there and get extra exclusive content, I would recommend it. And plus, you'll get twice as much beard as you do.
Exactly. Yes, we give you the full beard on if you're a VIP member. Yeah, you can go to bearingarms.com/subscribe. You can use the super secret promo code GUNS and get 25% off of your VIP membership. And who knows? Maybe we'll even have a contest where I'll send you a lock of the beard. When and if I ever finally cut it off.
Everyone watching on YouTube, people listening on the podcast might be confused, but go to the YouTube channel and you'll see what I mean by twice the beard. All right. Well, thank you, Cam, for joining us. You really appreciate it. I think you gave us some wonderful thoughts and insights here. So come back again soon.
Thank you for the invite. I will come back whenever you want, and we'll have you on Bearing Arms Cam and Company before long, too.
Sounds wonderful. All right, and that is it for this week's episode of the Weekly Reload podcast. I think Cam gave us some really good insight there into how the whole Chipman situation is likely to turn out in the end, but I will certainly stay on top of it for you and keep you up to date on the latest developments on that and everything else going on in the gun world. So make sure you are subscribed over at The Reload. There's obviously a free weekly newsletter that goes out every Friday morning that gives you the latest on what's happened. And then there's the members newsletter that goes out on Sunday, which will include the early edition of the podcast, along with my exclusive analysis pieces. So make sure you go over and join. I will see you guys again real soon.
I made the devil run. I gave him poison just for fun. I had one friend, now there's none. I made the devil run. I broke so many bones, but none of them were ever my own.